rural Ontario. You thought you could buy 5 acres, park a trailer, throw up a cabin, and disappear? You weren't trying to flip property. You weren't asking for subsidies. You just wanted to be left alone. Then the township inspector showed up with a stop work order citing Ontario Building Code Amendment 2019 Division B, Section 9.36, Energy Efficiency. The fantasy died right there on your gravel driveway. They didn't say you're not allowed to live off-grid. They said your structure cannot receive a certificate of occupancy without grid-compliant energy system certified by a licensed professional. Same outcome. Cleaner language. You thought land ownership meant autonomy. They thought you misunderstood the terms. This isn't about safety. It's about control, revenue, and making damn sure independence stays theoretical. Tonight, we're counting down 5 Canadian provinces quietly making off-grid living almost impossible. Not with bans, but with math, you can't survive. You remember the videos, the Instagram feeds, the YouTube channels with 2 million subscribers showing you how some couple in their 30s ditched Vancouver rent, bought Crown land for $30,000 and built a timber frame cabin with their bare hands and a solar panel from Canadian Tire. They made it look like the last free move available. No landlord, no utility bills, no HOA telling you what color your shutters can be. You weren't trying to become a survivalist, you just wanted fewer bills and fewer people telling you what to do. By 2015, the cultural myth was fully operational. Off-grid living had become the new van life. Romantic, attainable, proof you could still opt out of the system if you were willing to work for it. What they didn't show you was the paperwork. Because by 2015, most provinces had already tied occupancy permits to code compliance, not habitability. Your cabin could be structurally sound, warm in winter, and completely livable. Didn't matter. If it didn't meet provincial energy standards, you legally couldn't sleep there. Translation: they never promised freedom. You just assumed it was included in the deed, and this is where the paperwork starts breathing down your neck. Between 2016 and 2018, something quiet happened across 3 provinces. Ontario, British Columbia, and Nova Scotia updated their building codes to align with national climate targets. The language was all about leadership, modernization, harmonization with federal energy goals. Nothing that sounded like a trap. In 2017, BC introduced the Energy Step Code. Voluntary, they said. Municipalities could adopt it if they wanted. Within 24 months, almost every regional district outside the Lower Mainland had written it into their development permits. Voluntary means mandatory once you actually try to live there. The Step Code didn't ban off-grid builds. It just required energy modeling reports before you could get a building permit. Reports cost anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000. For a cabin, you were planning to build yourself for under $15,000. Do the math. You're underwater before you hammer a single nail. Ontario was watching, and in 2019 they stopped pretending it was optional. Section 9.36 of the Ontario Building Code was amended to tighten energy efficiency standards across all new residential structures, including those in unserviced rural areas. Translation: your solar setup has to meet the same standards as a suburban subdivision, or you don't get occupancy. Ontario didn't bother with the voluntary theater. They just made it law. Let's talk about the certificate of occupancy. You've probably never heard of it unless you've tried to build something. It's the single piece of paper that determines whether you're allowed to legally live in a structure you own, on land you own, that you paid for with money you earned. No certificate of occupancy means no legal residence, which means no home insurance, no financing if you need it, no utilities even if you wanted them, and if the township decides to push the issue, you can't sleep there without risking fines or a court order. The certificate isn't granted when your build is safe. It's granted when your build is compliant. Here's what that looked like in practice. In 2018, a man in northern Ontario finished a 240-square-foot cabin. Insulated. Functional wood stove, composting toilet. Off-grid solar array he'd wired himself after watching a dozen YouTube tutorials and reading the manufacturer's manual cover to cover. He applied for occupancy. Denied. Reason: lack of an electrical safety authority approved grid connection. He argued the cabin didn't need a grid connection. It had solar. They said the solar system wasn't certified by a licensed electrician, and even if it was, the cabin still needed a path to grid power in case the solar failed. Cost to fix it, $11,000 for an $18,000 cabin, plus $900 a year in property taxes, and zero legal right to sleep in the place he built. Translation: you didn't fail the build, you failed the system. You thought the hard part was construction. Turns out the hard part is permission. Ontario sells itself as practical, balanced, reasonable. The kind of place where regulations exist to protect people, not to punish them. Then you try to build a cabin and you meet Section 936. The Ontario Building Code amendments that rolled out after 2019 tightened energy efficiency standards across the board. The language was technical, buried in subsections about thermal resistance and air leakage rates. What it meant in practice was this: your off-grid build now had to meet the same standards as a grid-tied suburban home. Energy modeling reports, mandatory. Costs ranged from $2,000 to $4,000 depending on how far you were from an engineer willing to do the work. Licensed designers for off-grid systems, also mandatory. Even if you were using a plug-and-play solar kit, you needed a professional engineer's stamp saying it met code. Inspections ran between $2,000 and $4,000 per visit. And because you're rural, the inspector's driving 60 to 120 kilometers just to get to you. That travel time gets billed. Permit review cycles stretch to 60 or 90 days, sometimes longer if your township only had one building official working part-time. In Muskoka, a builder spent $8,000 on permits and inspections for a 200-square-foot cabin. Structurally sound, fully insulated, composting systems in place. The township condemned it anyway. Reason: insufficient path to grid electricity. Translation: they don't say no. They invoice you until you quit. British Columbia saw Ontario's mess and decided to raise the stakes. BC brands itself as Canada's climate leader. Progressive, green. The kind of province that cares about the environment enough to make bold policy moves. The Energy Step Code was introduced in 2017 as a voluntary framework. Municipalities could choose to adopt it. Most did. By 2020, it was effectively province-wide. Steps ranged from 1 to 5. Step 3 and above required net zero compliance pathways, which sounds great until you realize what that means for someone trying to build off-grid. Net zero doesn't mean you're energy independent. It means your system has to be designed, modeled, and certified to produce as much energy as it theoretically consumes, calculated using grid-based assumptions. Standalone solar? Doesn't count. You need an engineer to sign off on the system. Engineers don't work cheap, and most of them don't want to touch off-grid builds because the liability isn't worth it. Here's the impossible math. A $14,000 solar system, $6,000 for energy modeling, $4,000 for the engineer's stamp. Your land is worth $35,000. A woman in the BC interior installed a solar array on her property, fully functional. Powered her cabin, her water pump, her lights. She applied for a certificate of occupancy. Denied. Reason: the system wasn't grid-tied, and the township's development permit required Step 4 compliance. She appealed. Lost. Translation: green doesn't mean independent, it means supervised. You'd think Alberta, freedom-loving, conservative Alberta, would push back on this kind of overreach. They didn't. Alberta calls itself the Freedom Province. Low taxes, less regulation, the kind of place where people can still make their own decisions without the government looking over their shoulder. That brand works great until you try to live off-grid. Alberta's Safety Codes Act governs building standards, but enforcement happens at the municipal level through development permits. And that's where things get tight. Rural counties across the province started requiring utility connections where available as a condition of occupancy. Wells were allowed, septic was allowed, but if municipal, water was within a certain distance, usually defined by the utility, not you, you had to connect. Same with electricity. A retiree in central Alberta bought land with a functioning well, drilled years earlier, clean water, no issues. He started building a small retirement cabin. The county told him he had to connect to municipal water. The line ran within 400 meters of his property boundary, which meant connection was reasonably available. Cost: $23,000 for the hookup, plus $1,200 a year in minimum service fees. He argued he didn't need municipal water. Didn't matter. The county's development permit required connection to available utilities. He paid, translation, freedom as long as it bills monthly. If you think conservative provinces are the problem, wait until you see what Quebec does with paperwork. Quebec doesn't pretend to be friendly to people who want to build their own way. The province runs on process, bureaucracy, and the assumption that if you're doing something, someone needs to approve it first. The Code de Construction du Québec applies province-wide, but municipal zoning overlays add another layer. And if you're an Anglophone trying to navigate the system, good luck. Building applications must be submitted in French. Engineering reports in French. If you hire a consultant to translate and file everything for you, that's another few $1,000s before you've poured a footer. Permit reviews are centralized in many regions, which means delays, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months if your file gets kicked back for missing documentation. A couple outside Montreal bought rural land in 2019. They wanted to build a 300-square-foot cabin, off-grid. Simple. They applied for a building permit, denied. Reason, incomplete energy compliance documentation. They hired a consultant, reapplied, denied again, this time for insufficient septic design details. Total cost before they gave up, $9,000 in consultant fees, $1,500 to file an appeal they ultimately lost. The cabin was never built. Translation, delay is denial with better manners. If you think Quebec is the worst of it, let's talk about the Atlantic provinces. Nova Scotia markets itself as small-town Canada. Friendly, reasonable, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and the government doesn't get in your way. Then you try to build off-grid, and you find out the province's Building Code Act has teeth. Off-grid builds are technically allowed, but only if grid power is not reasonably accessible. And who decides what's reasonable? The utility company. If a power line runs within a kilometer of your property, sometimes less, depending on the municipality, you're required to connect. Not encouraged, required. A man built a cabin 900 meters from the nearest power line. He had solar. He had battery storage. He didn't need the grid. The municipality said 900 meters was within reasonable connection distance. He had to tie in. Cost $18,000. He appealed to the Provincial Review Board. They upheld the decision. Reason, public safety, and consistency with provincial energy policy. Translation, reasonable for them, ruinous for you. 5 provinces. Different politics, different branding, same result. You can't build off-grid in Canada without permission. And permission costs more than most people can afford. Let's talk about the people who tried anyway. The woman in BC who installed solar panels and got her occupancy permit denied. She didn't give up. She hired a lawyer, filed an appeal, and spent 2 years fighting the municipality. She lost. The cabin sits empty, legally uninhabitable. The couple in Ontario who built without permits because they thought they didn't need them. The township found out, fined them $50,000. They sold the land at a loss. The retiree in Alberta, who was forced onto the municipal water grid despite having a functioning well. He paid the connection fee, he pays the minimum service charge every month. He doesn't use the water. These aren't edge cases. They're the norm. Every one of them thought land ownership meant autonomy. Every one of them learned the same lesson. You own the dirt. You don't own the right to live on it. The letters they received were polite, professional, stamped with municipal logos and signed by officials with titles like Development Officer and Chief Building Inspector. The message was always the same. Comply or leave. Translation, compliance isn't encouraged, it's enforced. Here's the pattern. Fees $2,000 to $12,000 depending on the province. Distance to inspectors 60 to 120 kilometers in rural areas. Wait times 6 to 18 months for permit approvals. The result? Permit applications drop. Build a stall. People give up. In Ontario, building permit applications for rural off-grid structures declined by over 40% between 2018 and 2022. Not because people stopped wanting to build, because the math stopped working. You can't spend $15,000 on permits and compliance for a cabin that costs $20,000 to build. The numbers don't close, and the provinces know it. They don't need to ban off-grid living. They just need to make it expensive enough, slow enough, complicated enough that most people walk away. No public hearings, no angry debates, just quiet policy changes written in technical language, buried in code amendments that nobody reads until it's too late. Translation, no ban needed. The numbers do it for them. Why does this keep happening? Follow the money. Utilities need customers, captive customers. If 10,000 people go off-grid, that's 10,000 fewer monthly bills, 10,000 fewer ratepayers subsidizing infrastructure maintenance. Municipalities need tax revenue. Property taxes fund roads, services, and emergency response. But they also need to justify those services. If you're off-grid, you're not calling for water main repairs, you're not using the electrical grid, you're not a good investment. Provincial governments follow incentives, energy targets, climate commitments, political optics. It's easier to meet emissions goals when everyone's on a grid you can regulate than when people are scattered across the bush with solar panels you can't monitor. Nobody's sitting in a smoke-filled room plotting against off-grid builders. They don't have to. The system runs itself. Public safety becomes the language. Revenue protection is the outcome. Translation, it's not a conspiracy, it's a business model. Here's what land ownership actually means in Canada. You own the property, you pay the taxes, you're responsible for maintenance, liability, and upkeep. But you don't own the right to live there. That right is conditional. It depends on a certificate of occupancy, and the certificate depends on compliance with codes written by people who've never met you and don't care what you want. Occupancy isn't a right, it's a permit, and permits can be denied. You thought buying land meant freedom, autonomy, the ability to step outside the system and build a life on your own terms. The system thought you misunderstood the contract. Let's go back to where we started. Rural Ontario, gravel driveway, township inspector, holding a stop work order. You thought buying land meant freedom. Now you know better. The grid isn't just electrical, it's economical, ideological, and enforced by code. They don't need to ban independence. They just need to make sure it requires a permit and then make the permit impossible to get. You're not a criminal. You're not a threat. You're just someone who wanted to be left alone. But being left alone isn't an option they're willing to give you. Subscribe if you want more of this exposed because they're counting on you staying confused.